Thank you so much for your patience, but we appreciate you all being here today for our first coffee talk, Elliott Coffee Talk of the semester. We have a special guest, Dr. Gregory Beale. Dr. Beale actually spent the early part of his life in Dallas, and he has a Bachelor of Humanities in Philosophy and History, and a Master of Arts from both from Southern Methodist University, and he has a THM from Dallas Theological Seminary with a concentration in Greek, Hebrew, Biblical and Theological Studies, and a PhD in Greek and Hebrew exegesis. He has served as faculty at Grove City College, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Wheaton College, and currently he serves at Westminster Theological Seminary, where he served since 2010. Dr. Beale is a well-written author who has published numerous articles, academic papers, and books. And he is married to Mary, and they have 3 children. We also have some of his books for sale, including some more recent work like Revelation, a shorter commentary, and Hidden, but now Revealed. You can get these at our Seminary Hill bookstores. We have a book display over there with these titles and some others. And if you were to buy some, and I'm sure Dr. Beale would be glad to stick around a couple extra minutes and sign some for you. So thank you very much for being here today. And without any further delay, we'll have Dr. Beale.
Well, it's good to be here. And I was asked to speak at this event some months ago, and so I thought, well, I'll just do something and title it Reflections on Writing a Doctoral Dissertation. But I am curious, how many doctoral students are here? Raise your hand if you are a doctoral student. How many MDiv students? Do we have any MDiv? How many THM? Okay, thanks. I guess one of the best ways to begin is with my own experience at the University of Cambridge. I remember having submitted my dissertation, and it was a warm summer day when I was examined over it, and 2 doctoral examiners were on one side of a little bitty table, and I was on the other side, and it was very hot, and I had these wire rim glasses on, and one of my problems during the oral was I was so nervous the glasses were fogging up. So I had to take the glasses off, but then I couldn't read as well that way, so I was kind of going back and forth. And so these things can be rather nerve-wracking. I later found out that some students go in, they don't even have an oral. The dissertation is so wonderful that the examiners just serve tea and they have a good old time. Well, that wasn't the case with mine, but I did pass. I'm grateful for that. And maybe under this topic of reflections on writing a doctoral dissertation, it's good to know the kinds of PhD programs there are. Now, the kind of program, as I understand it, you're in, the kind of program we have at Westminster Seminary is the typical American program where you do 2 years of classwork and you have your comprehensives and then you do your dissertation. Kind of the opposite from that is the English route, where you just go and do a dissertation. At Wheaton, we started a PhD program when I went there, Dr. Moo and I and a few others, and we decided we liked both systems, and so we developed a PhD program that we called the Mid-Atlantic program, where you have fewer classes than the typical American system, and you start writing your dissertation from the very beginning. So those are different routes. I would say for some of you, it's not most of you, but some of you are in the MDiv and THM. If you do decide to do a doctoral program overseas, since it is a research program and you really don't typically take many classes, what you need to really do is be very prepared. I would say have a THM, MDiv and a THM before you undertake such a program. Because you're not going to take courses, whereas perhaps a THM may not be as necessary entering into a typical American program because you're going to have some rigorous 2 years of courses. And still, it would be ideal to have a THM when entering any PhD program. So I've given you a handout, and the first topic is choosing a topic, a dissertation topic. Here I'm speaking of doctoral dissertations, not THM dissertations, but most of the principles probably would apply. This, of course, is the most important thing that you need to do. The topic needs to be unique. You'll notice I've left some space there, unless you want to take some, if you want to take notes, because most of what I'm going to say is under this topic this morning. So it needs to be a unique topic. It needs to be a contribution to scholarship. And what that means is, therefore, publishable. I think if you're going to spend 3 or 4 or however many years, 5, working on a dissertation topic, it sure would be nice to have your research see the light of day. And so choose a topic that's a contribution. Now, how do you do that? Well, there are many ways to do that, but one of the best, the way to begin is go to your bibliographies. For example, when students first begin, in fact, in our program, even though we're a typical American program, part of the application is that they have to come up with a dissertation proposal. And we'll talk about how important that is. And of course, that gets honed. They'll interact with the professors even before, during their application. And what I tell students, and especially if they really don't have a topic honed, by the time they get to campus, I tell them, well, just go to New Testament Abstracts, Religion Index 1 and 2, and Elenchus Bibliographicus. Now, I'm assuming most of you have heard of those. If you haven't heard of those, talk to your professor and go look at those. And one of the most important things you can do, let me ask this question: how many of you are in biblical studies in your doctoral program? Biblical studies, okay. How many in systematics? Okay. How about church history? Okay. In terms of biblical studies, you can do what I call a passage-specific search in all 3 of those bibliographical sources. And New Testament Abstracts and Religion Index 1 and 2 are online. I don't think that Elenchus Bibliographicus is. Robert, is that online? I don't think it is it? It is? Okay. So you can, we don't have that online at Westminster, but I'm glad to hear it's online here. So you do a passage-specific search. That's going to take you all the way back to the 1920s. Do it thoroughly and see what's been written, articles, books, etc. And you need to be sure that nothing's been written right on what you're talking about. Otherwise, it's not going to be a viable dissertation. And if it does pass, something's wrong in the system. So I have one student, he's a graduate of Wheaton College, and his MA in exegesis, and he went to University of Cambridge and did a PhD on the Old Testament background of the Abrahamic promise. And doing a great job. Supervisor says looks great, and he goes to get it examined, and they say, guess what? Something's just been written 9 months ago on your very topic. And they said, are you aware of that? His face got red. He said, nope. And they said, okay, see you later. You better go read that book and tell us if you have anything to contribute that that book hasn't said. And as it so happens, and some of you may identify with this, he was at that time a missionary in Europe. And so that's pretty tough. You know how missionaries are. They don't have even 24 hours isn't enough to do what they need to do. But he read this book, looked over it, and talked about what was a contribution in his dissertation as opposed to that work, came back, and they had tea. So it was a good outcome. But that can happen. So you may start out with a topic, and if no one's written on it, just pray. No one will write on it. All right, and if they do, you have to really look at that, even if it's in your last year, and see, okay, what's my contribution here? I remember I was writing a commentary on the book of Revelation, and a fellow by the name of David Awney was also writing a major commentary on the Greek text of Revelation, and his was supposed to come out before mine, and I knew his was going to be a massive work, and it ended up being 3 volumes, and I was just praying that it wouldn't come out before mine came out, because I didn't want to have to interact with it. I mean, it's just masses of detail. And thank goodness, only the first volume came out as I was submitting mine, and so I had only to, in a limited way, interact with it. I have a student right now, it's his first year. He's been choosing a topic, and he wanted to do the Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern background of the sea serpent in Revelation 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, and he looked at all the bibliography, more than just this. By the way, there are more bibliographical sources than just New Testament abstracts and Religion Index 1 and 2 and Lincus Bibliographicus. There are others out there. They're just proliferating, especially on the internet. So you should be creative and look at those too. But it looked like he'd come down with a pretty narrow topic in terms of, I had kind of thought, since I'd worked in the book of Revelation, that something's been written as a monograph on that, and there had been some, but not the way he was approaching it. And so it looked like he was locked in, really, at the end of this first semester with that topic. And then he came to me and said, oh, guess what? I was looking at a German bibliography, and I found a German monograph. I've read it, and it's just exactly what I want to say. And so, a semester's gone by, and so now he's got to generate a new dissertation topic. It looks like what he's going to do is a study of irony in the book of Revelation, which, as far as I can tell, nobody has written on. So, you can choose a topic that people have written on, as long as your argument is different. Maybe you're going to come to a different conclusion, or it may be you're not coming to a different conclusion, but you have new evidence supporting what someone has said, radically new evidence. So that's okay. Now, there are 3 kinds of dissertations. My acquaintance Don Carson has mentioned these, and I'll mention these 2. I have many more kinds of dissertations to talk about, but he mentions 3. Number 1, they're topics where students think they know how and what they want to argue and the conclusion they want to come up with. Now, the problem with that kind of dissertation is the tendency, especially if you're, well, even if it's systematics, but in biblical studies, if that is your approach, then the temptation is going to be to eisegete, to read in your conclusion into the evidence. So, I mean, maybe it's a dissertation proving some point of Calvinism, or some point of Arminianism, or some point of Calvo-Arminianism, or maybe it's some point of eschatology. I'm not saying those are illegitimate topics, but you have got to be absolutely vicious in being sure that the evidence is shaping your conclusions and not your prior idea of what you want to do. Now, the opposite kind of dissertation is you have no idea. You're choosing a topic, you have no idea what you want to conclude, no idea how you want to argue. And I remember somebody giving a paper. This was just a paper, wasn't a dissertation, but he gave a paper on something about the book of Daniel. It was at a Tyndale House conference a number of years ago. And so he was looking at all this data, and then at the end he said, what do we make of this data? And he said, I have no idea. He says, but it's a contribution to scholarship, so you won't go down that avenue. And so don't do the research I've done, because it leads nowhere. That really probably is not going to be a viable article to publish or a viable dissertation. Probably the best dissertation is the kind that combines, so you kind of have an idea maybe where you want to go, you're not completely sure, so that it's somewhere in between the 2 that I just mentioned. Now, there are approaches where you're not sure what you want to argue, but the topic is so unique. It's never been written on. So even if you don't know how you want to argue and where you want to go in your conclusion, the topic may be so unique that whatever conclusion you come up with will be a contribution. For example, I've had students who have done, I had a student who worked on the use of mysterion, mystery, in 1 Corinthians. And however he was going to argue, I was convinced, I gave him the topic, and I said, you know, as long as you argue viably, exegetically, whatever conclusion you come up with, as long as it's supported by the evidence, it's going to be a contribution, because no one has written a monograph on the use of mystery in 1 Corinthians. In fact, he did very well, published it in a German monograph series out of Berlin. Likewise, I have a student right now who's working on the use of the Old Testament in Thessalonians. I don't know what she's going to do, how she's going to argue, what she's going to conclude. But no one has written a dissertation on the Old Testament in Thessalonians. Somebody's written an article, but not a dissertation. And likewise, I have another student working on Philippians. Now, someone's written on the use of the Old Testament in Philippians 2, but not in all of Philippians. So he's going to do that. Another student under me is working on Exodus and Revelation. Now, some have written on the Exodus themes in Revelation, Exodus traditions in Revelation, Exodus theology, but not actual use of the book of Exodus in Revelation. Now, even in these dissertations that I've just mentioned, there's some presuppositions. I mean, all of us have presuppositions. You can't get rid of them. No neutrality in any area. And so even in the dissertations I mentioned, which in this particular case are Old and the New dissertations, they're dissertations where really students are operating with a presupposition that the New Testament writers are using the Old Testament in line to some degree with the original meaning of the Old Testament. That's a presupposition because they tend to be evangelical students, and so they tend to have that presupposition. Now, at other schools where they work on Old and the New, sometimes their presupposition is the opposite, that there is no organic unity. And so you have to be careful even of those presuppositions. You want the evidence to shape your conclusions. Now, there are also topics in which they're so laden with a presupposition that the topic can only lead to failure. For example, if you're at a non-evangelical school, again, I'm speaking probably here more to MDiv or THM students who may go on to other schools, whether overseas or in the United States. If you're writing a paper or a dissertation that assumes the early date of the book of Daniel, you're going to fail. Or if it assumes the unity of the authorship of Isaiah, you're going to fail. Or if it assumes a Mosaic authorship of Pentateuch, you will fail. Talk to Ryan Stokes about that. Not that he failed, he didn't, he did very well, but he can tell you how evangelical presuppositions are treated in non-evangelical environments. He was at Yale, as many of you know. Or if you're in the New Testament, you're writing on Ephesians or especially the pastoral epistles, and you're assuming Pauline authorship, probably you're going to fail. And that brings up something. If you're an evangelical and you go to a non-evangelical environment, I've seen two kinds of students. Some come out stronger in their faith, and some come out completely conformed to the non-evangelical scholarship that they've been exposed to. It's very interesting to see that. And you have to really have your head screwed on very well when you go through such a program like that. I know a student who he compromised on the authorship issue in the New Testament. It's very easy to Abraham Kuyper, well-known Dutch theologian and Prime Minister of Holland around the turn 18 to 1900s, he said if you put a person on an island and everyone on that island is insane, it's only a matter of time before that normal person begins to take on some characteristics of the insane community, because we have such a penchant in us to want to be accepted. And that's the way it is when you get into these non-evangelical environments, because the world is now defined differently there than the world here or at Westminster or elsewhere. But most of you are not in that environment. But I think it's important that I mention that. I do know students who get 2 doctorates They do their doctorate in an evangelical place, and then they go to a university that's not evangelical. It may be the case with some of you. Then there are topics that are based on a mistaken methodological approach. For example, this is tragic. There was a student who was doing the use of the Old Testament in 1 Peter. This was many years ago, back in the 80s. And he was talking about the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac as a kind of a background for the sacrifice of Jesus and how it's depicted in 1 Peter. And he believed the key to understanding that was in the Aramaic Targum. And so he argued that. His conclusion basically was that the Aramaic Targum, the interpretation of the sacrifice of Isaac, was key to understanding the sacrifice of Christ in 1 Peter. And that was his conclusion. He was at the University of Oxford, and it scared me because the external examiner, well, actually he was internal at Oxford, his name was G.B. Caird, he flunked the dissertation. He said, how could Peter have been aware of this interpretation in the Targum if the Targum's dated at 4th century? Now you can always say, well, it represents an oral tradition that goes back, but that's kind of iffy. So that was really tragic. I was kind of, that kind of concerned me because I was about to be examined by G.B. Caird about 6 months later. And so, at any rate, I had some dreams about that. I'll spare you those. Then there's a student who wrote a dissertation on the use of Psalm 68:18 in Ephesians 4:8. Remember, he ascended on high, led captive his captives, gave gifts to men. And it's a quotation from Psalm 68:18. And as I looked through that dissertation, it was published. I looked through the dissertation, and there was nothing about Psalm 68, except that what Paul concluded was diametrically the opposite of what Psalm 68 was saying. And that what Paul concluded was based on what the early Jewish and especially later Jewish literature concluded about Psalm 68. And so that was his conclusion, and he passed it, and everything was fine in that case. I'm happy for him. I disagree with his approach, but it's a mistaken methodological approach. At some schools he wouldn't have passed. So you got to be careful, in the case of biblical studies, for example, of basic interpretations on Jewish traditions that occur much later than the 1st century. I remember reading a PhD abstract of a student who I was asked to evaluate his dissertation, and hearing the summary of it, I said, I'm not going to do it. I said, I'll flunk it. I said, why? Because I couldn't even understand what he was arguing. It was so confusing. So I didn't. I didn't evaluate that dissertation. Now, you also want to be aware of topics that cover too much. This is probably the biggest mistake. They'll come and they say, oh, I want to study the use of Isaiah in the New Testament. No, you can't. I had a student who wanted to study the use of Isaiah in all of the Gospel of John. And this was at Wheaton, and the dissertation committee said, no, but there are a number of references in chapter 12. Why don't you just limit it to chapter 12? And he did very well, published it, and everything went very well. Now, it is sometimes true that you can choose a broad topic, and if you have an amazingly unique approach, that's fine. For example, there's a fellow who wrote a dissertation titled The Origin of Paul's Gospel under F.F. Bruce back in the late 70s. His name is Say You, and it was a massive, it was covering all of Paul. And his thesis, however, was it's Paul's Damascus Road Christophany that shapes all of Paul's writings. And that all of Paul's thoughts come out of that experience. And it was a very good dissertation. Now, there were some articles that had argued that to some degree, in one way or another before, but no one had put it together as a monograph. So it was a very broad topic. It worked because he had a unique paradigmatic approach. Some topics may seem very narrow. Now, I've mentioned the use of Psalm 68:18 and Ephesians 4:8 and the approach that I didn't think was too good. Because I didn't think that approach was too good, I got one of my students. In fact, one of your students. His name is Todd Scasewater, and he did an MDiv here and then came to Westminster for a doctorate, just finished it a year or so ago, and he worked on the same passage and really dug into Psalm 68, dug into the use of the Old Testament in Psalm 68, especially in 68:18, and did, I think, a very good job, and he passed, and now he's trying to get that published. But that's just one verse. So you can do one verse. It's not necessarily too narrow. In fact, I would say it's better to err on the narrow side than the too broad of a side. There's a dissertation on Colossians 1:24. You know that famous passage, filling up the sufferings of Christ? It's a dissertation just on that passage. And what he did is he found that scholars had not seen all the uses of the verb that's used there outside of the New Testament. So he looked at the approximate 10 uses, went through them really carefully because it's very difficult even to translate those, and came up with a good thesis on what it meant in Colossians 1:24. It's a contribution. Dissertations don't have to be long. They can be short. I know a student who did 150 pages, published in the WUNT series in Germany. So it can be done, not as in the sciences. I mean, sometimes in the sciences and math, you can have a 2-page dissertation, as long as the mathematical formula is novel and it works. Your topics may morph. They may change. You may have a good topic, but as time goes on, as you see who's published on something, or just the way your own research goes, your topic will morph. I remember my topic at the University of Cambridge was the use of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. And when I got to Cambridge, my supervisor said, the first thing you're going to do is you're just going to read in early Judaism. You're going to do that for the whole year. And I went, ugh. And I said, because I was hyper-canonical. I mean, why should I read that stuff? It's not the Bible. I want to see, how's the Old Testament used in the book of Revelation? I started reading it. And it ended up that from my dissertation, the first half was the use of Daniel in early Jewish apocalyptic and then in the book of Revelation. And what I found were there were some exegetical patterns in Judaism that were similar and gave some insight into the book of Revelation. We'll talk about that. For myself, you must be aware of basing things on Judaism, as I've already mentioned. But this is early Judaism. Now for myself, quite frankly, I don't think that there's any interpretation, and this is a sweeping statement, this is just a parenthesis here. I don't think that there is any passage in the Bible that an A&E background or a Jewish background is completely determinative of its meaning. That's a big statement, and it could be challenged, I realize. But for myself, certainly that material enhances the meaning of biblical passages and may significantly enhance the meaning of biblical passages. Ultimately, I see that Jewish material as commentary material. We really appreciate the commentary. You pull a commentary down. All of you have had an aha moment reading an Old or New Testament commentator from 1990s or 21st century, and you say, oh my gosh, I've never seen that. But you realize you have this aha moment because you can see what the commentator is saying is really true. And well, why not push the commentary literature back 2,000 years to Judaism? There were some good Jewish exegetes, and so they can give insights too. That's how I kind of treat that background material. Also, I would say, as evangelical students, that being evangelical, which here I have in mind, holding to the full inspiration of the Bible, can actually put us on the cutting edge of scholarship. What do I mean? Well, you get evangelical fundamentalists, and they use the steamroller approach. They come to a difficult passage, and they just steamroll over it with some kind of harmonization that really doesn't work. But they think it does. And then you read non-evangelical scholars on it, and they have a fundamentalism. It's all just a mistake. And they don't even investigate it anymore. Someone said it's a mistake early on, and they said, yeah, it's a mistake. And yep, that's just a mistake. But if you have a high view of Scripture, and if you're honest with the text, you don't steamroll it like an evangelical fundamentalist, but you don't assume the fundamentalism of liberalism either. You say, I'm going to work on that passage. I'm going to work on it. It's like a weed in a putting green. You don't just mow over it. You keep working on it and working on it. One of my former students went to Cambridge and did the use of Isaiah and Mark. And the very first passage in Mark is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah. Then it quotes Malachi, followed by Isaiah. And so, what's going on here? Did Mark not know his Bible? Because he doesn't mention Malachi. And that student's name is Ricky Watts. We were sitting in a Cambridge seminar with Moore Hooker, who was lecturing on, giving a paper on the use of the Old Testament in Mark. And of course, she comes to that passage, the first shot out of the bag of her paper. And she says, of course, Mark had a schoolboy knowledge of the Old Testament. He didn't realize he's quoting Malachi, thought it was all Isaiah. And Watts went on to show that Isaiah was the major influence in the Gospel of Mark from the Old Testament, and that often in Judaism and even in the New Testament you find one passage being pulled in from the Old Testament to explain another passage. We call it midrash. Well, it has many meanings. And so what he concluded is that Mark was concerned with Isaiah and that Malachi only supported Isaiah. And he convinced Hooker later on in that regard. And so, but he had a high view of Scripture. And now, Roman numeral 2, research and writing on a topic. Try to pinpoint a topic from the very beginning of your PhD course of study. By the way, if you can find scholarships, do it so you can be full-time. I would say if you are, try to be aware of getting too involved in ministry or too involved in a job. Now, I know Providence deals us hands that we have to do one or the other. But ideally, if you can get some scholarships, just do intense study. Get out of your doctoral program, and then you have the rest of your life for ministry or maybe the job you want to do. Also, if at all possible, I'm speaking of the ideal here, learn German and French right before you start your PhD program. Some of my students, for example, when they choose their topic early, what they can do in their coursework, even before the dissertation stage, is they can take an independent study, perhaps, and write a chapter in their dissertation. We have readings in Judaism at our school, and so we have two, a readings 1, a readings 2, and if they know the dissertation topic, and students that tend to work under me do Old and the New, and so they can do a lot right there, see how their passage was interpreted in Judaism. We also have an Old and the New course, and they can write one of their chapters there, and I suspect there are courses here where you can kill two birds with one stone. Some courses are so unique, you can't do that. So if possible, again, if you're not too involved in ministry, you're not too involved in work, I'd work 6 days a week and work most of the day. Be intense, finish, use your summers as well. Now, be careful of reading around. Now, this especially is true of students who go to England. I remember talking to a student in his beginning of his third year. I said, what's your topic? He said, I'm still reading around to try to find what it is. And that can even happen here in the American system as well. Try to hone that topic. Work with your supervisor. And find a topic your supervisor is interested in. I tend to want to give my students topics I'm interested in because I only have so long to live. I can't write on everything I would love to, so I give my students those topics. But what happens is I'm interested in them. I'll find myself working, and I say, oh my gosh, I got to send Joe an email here, tell him to look at this source on his topic. I'm interested in it, you see. But if you're doing something your supervisor's not interested in, they're not going to be, alert as much as they would otherwise. And choose a topic, some of this is common sense, that you're interested in. That is, someone has said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that dissertations are composed of two things on your part, inspiration and perspiration. And the inspiration really gets you through the perspiration. But there's a lot of labor involved in the dissertation. And I found students who are very, very smart, but they're not used to doing a lot of labor in their studies because things come so easy to them. But a dissertation is different. You've got to do manual labor. And I find that some students who are really, really smart, they tend to not do that labor. And students that may not be as smart, they're very capable and competent, but they may not be as smart. They work really hard and they come out with amazing dissertations. Now, if you find a genius that works hard, then you got an amazing, amazing dissertation. Don't write too much. I know a student who wrote 500 pages when he should have written 300. He failed the first time around because the main points get lost, especially when it's your first time around. So find a topic you're interested in. A third major point is Roman numeral 3 on the page. Read papers at conferences. Go to the Evangelical Theological Society. Once you've gotten along, you've written a few chapters, read something at ETS or Society of Biblical Literature, and then there are regional ETSs and regional SBLs. There's the Tyndale House Conference for Biblical Studies in England as well. So test your chapters out. Likewise, I would say send a chapter out to a scholar who has worked in that area, not your supervisor, but to a scholar outside of your school, and ingratiate yourself and see what you can see if it's right on their topic. They may be interested in reading what you're doing because they want to keep abreast of ongoing scholarship. And doctoral students, good doctoral students, is a good way to keep abreast of scholarship. So they may be willing to read it and comment on that. That's just a way to secure the fact that you're on the right track. Roman numeral 4, be cautious about trying to publish too much during doctoral work. There's students, especially today, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, some of these students will publish 4 or 5 articles before they finish their dissertation. Why? They want a job, which I completely understand. And so it enhances their resume. But what happens is, especially in the American system where you're taking 2 years of courses of comprehensives at the end, it really elongates your program. The longer you're in a doctoral program, whether due to over-involvement in ministry, whether due to over-involvement in outside work, whether due to over-involvement in writing articles for publication, the longer you're in a doctoral program, the less likely it is you're going to graduate. Now, our problem at Westminster is we have people in ministry. When they finish comprehensives, they go into ministry, and that's tough. And some of those students never graduate. So we're trying more and more to come up with ideas to get them out more quickly. And one is have their dissertation topic ready right when they start that first semester. So be careful of that. If you do find a chapter and it looks really tight, really good in your dissertation, and you don't have to do much revision, okay, send it off for publication. Fine. 6, this is a touchy issue, the issue of plagiarism. Recently, there has been a discovery of plagiarism among world-class evangelical scholars. I'm not going to mention their names. You can talk to your professors. But world-class evangelical scholars affirm all of them inerrancy. And they've been accused of plagiarism. In the case of one, it may be that it seemed that he quoted his supervisor extensively. And it was over a period of years. He had just absorbed, apparently, what his supervisor had said. As I understand it, this is not firsthand, but this plagiarism can happen when you have a research student do a lot of your writing and you're not careful in checking it. Got to be careful there. But that's on down the line for those of you who become professors. This can happen with articles. I know someone who was doing a text-critical article in a particular epistle, and someone else was doing an article on the same text-critical problem. And they both were submitted to very outstanding refereed international journals, and one plagiarized. It ended up that it wasn't intentional. In fact, most of these that I mentioned, in my opinion, were not intentional, but nevertheless, it happened. Be very careful of that. In my own research, I've had times where I've had to say, okay, in one particular case, I had to think, did I get this idea from so-and-so? Because I read this fellow a long time ago, and I wasn't sure if I'd really gotten the idea. And so, to cover myself, I said, I may have gotten this idea from so-and-so in a footnote, just being honest. Be very, very, very careful. Finally, spend a semester overseas. Very important for evangelical doctoral students. If you can do it, find some money somehow. Spend a semester. Tyndale House, Oxford, Tübingen. All three of these places have evangelical places where you can go. And do your research over there. Get involved in the scholarly evangelical community over there. I think it would be very, very helpful. Ultimately, we want to serve the church with what we write. That's what we want to do. And so if possible, write on something that at some point you can revise to whatever degree that serious Christian readers could read. Now, that's not always the case. You might write on a text-critical problem, and not everybody's going to want to read that. But as much as possible, all things being equal, try to write on something of interest that could build up the church. And of course, ultimately, and this is really a problem, and maybe some in the room can identify with me, there's always a struggle to write for your name and glory instead of God's name and glory. Why do we want to be published? Get our name out there? Well, how does that relate to getting God's name out there? I think we want God's name to be exalted. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time. We ask that you would cause us, in all that we think and say and do, would be honoring to you. In Christ's name, amen. Well, I think we have 5 minutes. Do we have 5 minutes?
Yes, we have a few minutes for...
There may be no questions. We can go straight to snacks or...
Does anyone have a question for Dr. Beale? Question? This is your time. All right. Well, if there's no questions, I can be dismissed. We have some... What? Do you have a question? Okay, good. We make sure it's recorded for all time. Who's the matter?
What do you suggest as advice for those of us who are hoping to get a job in academia? Are there things that I'll leave it as general as can be.
Yeah. Well, if you're in a doctoral program, again, I'll just pull from what I've already said in some ways. Be sure that you're writing on a topic that has not been published on. And if you are, then really work on that. Look at monographs and monograph series and what they look like, whether it's the BZNW series out of Berlin or the WUNT series out of Tübingen, or it's the Library of Christian of New Testament Studies in England. or whatever, look at those and see what genre they look like. And I would say, if possible, if you have a chapter that's really nice, try to publish it ahead of time. Don't get too caught up in that because it can distract you from your final goal. So I would say that's number one. Finish your dissertation successfully. Get it published. If possible, there are usually opportunities for doctoral students to teach. Now that's another problem because that can distract you from finishing. So if you can teach, well, our doctoral students can teach Greek, for example. And so, once you teach Greek the first time, then it takes much less time the second time when you teach it. So, but that's nice to have on your resume that you've taught. And if you have some good evaluations, make sure you keep your evaluations from the students. Thirdly, be involved in your local church, because it's likely that if you're coming from an evangelical seminary, a doctorate from that seminary, the likelihood is you're going to be teaching at a seminary, not Yale or TCU or whatever. Be teaching in a seminary. So seminaries really do, or a Christian college. They want to see some ministry experience, especially at the seminary. Christian college, not as much, but if it's a seminary, then you need to show involvement and interest in the church. In the case of many seminaries, they want to see that at least you're under care, that is, that you're in process of heading toward ordination in some way, and that you've preached a little bit, you've got some ministry experience. So those would be the three. The publication, the teaching, and then the ministry experience, and that you're striving to be a godly person. People want to know that they're hiring godly people who are also scholars.
I have one more question if anyone has one.
Dr. Beale, in choosing a dissertation topic, let's say that there is another dissertation that's been written that you found compelling, but you completely disagreed with the conclusions drawn and wanted to write against that particular dissertation. How is it possible to integrate that into your own topic selection, or is that too polemical an approach?
No, that's great, as long as you don't get mean. No, that's exactly what you want to do. I talked about writing on a topic, and it may be even that you agree with the conclusions of the dissertation or the publication, but you found new evidence to support it, or a new way to argue to support it. That could be viable. But in this case, yeah, like in the case of Todd Skasewater, his dialogue partner / opponent was this fellow who wrote on Psalm 68 and Ephesians 4 and said that Paul's use is dependent on Judaism, which is quite different from the idea of the psalm. And Todd was arguing, no, Paul's got the idea of the psalm. And so, hey, he did it very well. You can do it winsomely, and you don't have to do it. And you can write polemically, and I would say be very careful of trying. This is really important. Do the best you can to describe your opponent's view as you think the opponent would describe it if they were in front of you. Sometimes in class, and it's inevitable, all of us do this as professors, we'll be talking about something and we'll say, so-and-so holds this view, but I think he or she is wrong. And then I'll often catch myself and I'll say, it probably would be a much better argument if so-and-so were right here, right now, But do your best. In fact, this is really what I would call the hermeneutics of integrity and love. To love your neighbor. So as you're writing that dissertation, love him or her and present the argument as best as you can. That's loving your neighbor. But you got a great topic if that's the case, as long as you bounce it off your supervisor.